the point is that what is interesting in relation to theory from the South is that we cover similar ground, but in ways that some people find very different, tellingly different, but that much of the debate, at least in Europe, in Oxford and Cambridge and then beyond, around this question of decolonizing knowledge, the disciplines, the university, and as a kind of politics of where we are now globally, really emerged out of the student movement in South Africa. Rhodes must fall, fees must fall, and the entire movement around that came to grips with what it meant to decolonize within a university. And the interesting question was that what emerged, for instance, in Oxford and Cambridge, initially around this question of what we might mean by decolonization, and in particular for anthropology, but I think that is kind of iconic of many of the other debates, started with theory from the South. So that some of you may know that in 2018, there was a special edition of the Cambridge Journal of Anthropology, largely a graduate student-run operation, that had a series of papers on the topic about Cambridge, about English universities, about anthropology. But it started with a citation from theory from the South and the assumption that old margins had become new frontiers, and that in fact there was a kind of dialectic going on where much of the critical insight about the world in general and social theory in particular was coming from the peripheries and had done so for a very long time. In America, and let me say there in England, the debate was different from the one in America in many ways, in that the question of what colonization meant and where it was located geospatially and hemispherically was very much one that took in Europe as well. So that, for instance, the question of, within Britain, are we seeing with Brexit something that has to do with the decolonization of Britain, the role of Ireland, the role of Scotland, and the sense that there are centers and peripheries, norths and souths within Europe itself, and that much theory making, therefore, about the decolonization of knowledge and the way we think about it and the practices surrounding it and so on, came from sources of critical theory that were not literally colonial or post-colonial. And there was a sense there that what you did, for instance, in teaching anthropology, was to teach the canon and to deconstruct the canon simultaneously, side by side. So it wasn't so much a sense that you looked to some other form of Southern indigenous knowledge as a kind of ontology that would provide an outside, constitutive outside that would unseat the center. It was much more about various sources of critique and epistemological evaluation that emerged from within the disciplines within Europe, from its traditional sources of critical theory, and linked that to what had come from the colonial world and was coming from it, the post-colonial world, not yet fully post-colonial. In the US, as many of us know, the debate has been somewhat different, and at least in the context of anthropology, there's been a very much more assertive sense, and linking it to the understanding of the US as a colonial settler society, to things like abolitionism, to Afro-pessimism, to the sense that, in fact, in anthropology, there is a case for letting it all burn, and that there has to be a radical transformation as to who produces knowledge and theory. For instance, the North has always produced its anthropological capital in the South, and the feeling is the moment has come now where those who were the traditional spokespeople must move aside, and there's a new generation and a new, if you like, political location for the discipline itself. This has gone together with a critique of the university, and in some places a much more head-on confrontation with what decolonialism might mean, including some sections of that debate, which argue that up to now within the academic and elite circles, it's been used largely metaphorically, the term decolonization or decoloniality, and that the time has come to move this to things like the reclamation of land from settlers, the recognition of indigenous land rights, and so on. So that is the sort of interesting landscape, it seems to me, against which theory from the South has to be reread. And depending on how you see it, this is just another text, theory from the South, from people who grew up as white colonizers in a post-colony and now speak from elite university contexts in the North, and that, that the kind of theory making that is being advocated in theory from the South has had its day, and there is a new that needs itself to be decolonized. The argument, in short, in theory from the South, starts off from a very similar position from decolonization, is to say that knowledge production, the nature of truth, the nature of theory, the idea of civilization has always been located in the North, and its objects have been in the South. The South has been the source of data, the source not of theory making in itself. But the difference, I think, that we've emphasized in theory from the South is that we see that that relationship between North and South is a highly dialectical one. And that, in fact, the very knowledge that emerges in the hegemony in the North, in its institutions of higher learning, within its disciplines, has often cannibalized not only on knowledge from the South, but on knowers from the South. And there's been an appropriation of many of the most fertile thinkers from the South into the North. And the South is still treated in a way as a source simply of raw material, very much on parallel with the idea of the way that economy works. And where you speak from makes a tremendous difference. Now, when we talk about North and South, we're also implying here not a kind of literal geophysical, geographical location. We are talking here, and we try to make this plain, about, first of all, a kind of relationship of opposition. For linguists, a kind of deictic relationship. It's the relationship of here and there, center and periphery. And that is not necessarily literally grounded, although it, of course, has a colonial history. But it also means that Europe has its South, the US has its South. That within, for instance, countries like Italy, you have a North and South. Within England, you have a center and a periphery. And that therefore what we're talking about more is eccentric knowledge, eccentric, i.e. non-centered, to use Homi Bhabha's term. The term for the production of thought and knowledge from its peripheries on the part of those who are part of a global system, part of modernity, part of the postmodern world, part of the global economy in knowledge production and practice and indeed material production. But look at the center from its outsides, from its constitutive margins, if you like, from its margins. And that therefore that kind of eccentricity has bred a certain kind of critical awareness, if you like, of the master and his or her world and tools. And that it's that kind of position from which a significant amount of the insight in the contemporary world is coming. And we make that argument against the background also of the sense that modernity itself has always been a multilateral production. And that what we look at when we look at the colonized world or the post-colonized world is not some kind of indigenous outside, but as another vantage on modernity, another form of modernity with its own theories, maybe a peripheralized form, but a form that is not devoid of all of the things that make up the modern world, which is part of the history of colonialism, from industrial production and experiments in labor and urbanism and so on, to forms of Christianity, to understandings of the way that capitalism itself works, to forms of culture and so on. So the idea here is that we come from, all of us, from inside a modern world that is profoundly hybridizing and creolizing as it goes on. So it doesn't do away with the fact that there are always centers and periphery, sublimated domains of knowing and practice, but that we are part of what is a multilateral world, and the North-South dimensions of it is much more about a politics of extraction and subordination than it is about kind of hard and fast geographical separate worlds. And what we argue basically, and I'll end with this because I've already spoken for quite a while, is that increasingly, the North-South vectors, the idea of a kind of vanguard in the North and a kind of, if you like, a time lag kind of slow modernization, if you like, that follows behind in the South, makes no sense of the world in which we see today, and in which we live and observe today, because in fact, the way in which not only has Europe become proliferalized and provincialized, but that there is a globalization of the division of labor, of the sites of production that have a lot to do with the late histories of capitalism, which means that in the outsourcing of a lot of its production from the North to the former colonies in the South, there has been, if you like, a peripheralization of the countries of the North themselves and of the centers. Right? And what we see now is that, in a way, history has running ahead of the former metropole in what were the former colonies. And whether one's looking at the nature of capitalism, forms of industry, forms of biotechnology, forms of banking, the way in which experiments, even now, with the contradictions of capitalism and redistribution and inequality and so on are going on, and certainly critical thinking, much of this is coming from what were formerly peripheries. And the question of the North playing catch-up is an interesting one, because we're beginning to see many of the things that were classically associated with post-colonies, from kind of political instability to illiberalism, to forms of neo-fascism, to unemployment, to vast inequality, to deindustrialization, to the problems of the reproduction of society with youth. Many of these things are emerging in the North, informal economies, lack of work, and so on, that the South, the peripheries, have been dealing with for a very long time. And so, in a sense, the argument is we have to look there, at those former peripheries for the insights about the system at large. And in fact, we're already doing that. And a tremendous amount of the places where creative thinking come from, new experiments in social organization, forms of labor discipline, cultural sensitivities, and so on, were in fact from places which were formerly seen to be peripheral, whether we're looking within Europe or whether we're looking at the whole global order. So I'll leave it at that. And take it up.
Right. Raphael, do you want me to come in now?
Yes, please.
Okay. Yes. Jean, thank you very much for this very enlightening talk and for the time you have spent working on these issues about the South. I want to engage you in a conversation which may help me clarify a couple of issues. Other than your work, there is also the body of work that has been written about epistemologies of the South by the Portuguese scholar Bonaventura dos Santos and the Australian scholar Rowan Cornell. So when you were talking, what I was interested in, which I want to hear from you, is in what way does your work relate, or if you were to compare your work with that of Bonaventura dos Santos, who is also into issues about epistemologies of the South, what are the similarities and differences in the way you tackle the challenges about epistemologies of the South?
Okay, look, I think there's a good deal of similarity here. And of course, Rowan Cornell and Bonaventura are doing slightly different things.
Yes,
Rowan's work is really about the kind of knowledge that comes from the South, Southern theory.
Yes.
Right? Which is an important thing in itself, and coming from the kind of particularly the Australian perspective, it's fascinating, because Australia, like South Africa, is one of those places where the question of North and South is very much, if you like, in question. And one of the things we say in the book is that one of the difficulties is that there's a lot of North in the South and a lot of South in the North, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So that we're not dealing here with kind of homogeneous blocks, either in terms of political economy or in terms of political relations within the kind of overall global order, because in fact, Australia, like South Africa, is one of those places which, as I say, is a meeting ground. I mean, it's a place where, in fact, you have settler colonialism. It is internally a microcosm of North and South, center and periphery, but it also in itself is interestingly positioned in relation to everything from global political economy and the new axes of power, which are more north-south, less north-south and east-west. So, for instance, the relationship to China and between China and Africa is increasingly important now, and raises very similar questions of empire and center and periphery. And Australia is interestingly positioned. So that the idea of Southern theory is very much what Connell brings up, and the ways in which that uncomfortable position in a sort of post-colonial global modernity sense in Australia triggers certain sorts of insights and so on. But it's very specifically theory that comes from there. What we are trying to argue for more is the way in which the very idea of the South intervenes in theory, right? And we are suggesting that it's more the eccentricity, the more the position, if you like, of subdominance on an evolutionary scale, right? And a lot of this has to do with questions of developmentalism and the logic of modernization, people on the road to a kind of, if you like, global modernity, but not quite there, right? And that in those kinds of terms, it's not simply theory made in the South. It's people who are placed into that situation of displacement from the center in time and space. So that, for instance, we would be interested not only in theory, for instance, made in places like Australia or South Africa or Latin America or India or Southeast Asia, but the kind of input into that conversation that comes from peripheralized parts of Europe, comes from feminism, comes from forms of racialization within the mainstream body of societies in places like the US. So that, for instance, there is a kinship between much of the theory that comes from critical race theory and racial capitalism and the history, if you like, of the US and that of South Africa. Now, this is not theory of the South in a straightforward sense, but much of the work on racial capitalism is stuff that emerged in South Africa out of the conditions of literally apartheid labor and was picked up by people like Cedric Robinson in this country, has been put to work in all kinds of ways, right? And so that is a form of Southern theory, to use South in that sense, that Raymond Connell wouldn't be concerned with, right, in the same way, right? Even although she sees kinship. So ours is less literally an idea of the geophysical South, and more an idea of a structural location in relation to the centers of power, production, theory making. And what comes into that very often are issues of race and issues of culture, but also issues of class and gender, right? And so we are much more interested in the sense that there are these affinities. Why was it when we were studying apartheid history in South Africa that we looked to the workings of people like Raymond Williams and E.P. Thompson in England, who were writing about the making of the English working class, right? It's not the same, but there are extraordinary resonances there. And this comes to the point that one is interested also, not only in knowledge production and in culture, but in political economy and the nature of class and race and empire. Right? Now, when we come to the question of Dos Santos, there's a tremendous amount that we share here. And the fact that he is writing from Portugal, which after all is in Europe's south and Europe's periphery, right? So the interesting question there, you used to say, when I was growing up in South Africa, Africa starts at the Pyrenees. Portugal and Spain, they're part of it already. From the point of view of Nordic thinking, they're part of the southern, you push downwards, right? They're part of the south. I think that what is shared here is certainly the sense that what comes from being decentered, and particularly from the very extreme forms of civilizational discourse that was part of the colonial story, is an incorporation into the global story, but always from its constitutive margins. So the question of, for instance, how Christianity or labor relations or Marxian theory was picked up in Southern Africa or India or Latin America is part of a global conversation. It's a creolized form of that knowledge, but it is situated at a center where the truths and the contradictions of the hegemonic claims, the universalities of theory, the ideas of development, the notion of what is modern, are moderated by an experience at the periphery. The fact that you're not quite there, you included, but you excluded by very definition. The idea of nativism and that position within colonies, for instance, or peripheralization in ideas of underdevelopment. So this means that the theory is not necessarily indigenous. This is what we are concerned with here is not so much that you can find an unclaimed epistemology that has not been tainted by the logic of capitalism or the idea of modernity or the notion of liberalism and its lies, but that what you find is a version of that global history that has been critically reformulated in the positions that were those of the colony and the post-colony or the periphery in Europe and so on. So I think that Bonaventura's position still has this idea of boundary knowledges, that in fact, we in the North have a kind of constituted shared position of the sort, are the very homogenizing forms of Eurocentric culture and its power, right? And that we can have this kind of shock of epistemological otherness. If we go to places where people regard, for instance, growth or relationship to land or agriculture, or the idea of justice very differently. And this is very appealing at a time where things like environment and ecology, the Anthropocenic moment we're in, kind of calls for a sense of radical rethinking. What is value? What is growth? What really counts? How do you understand relationships that are less exploitative in our overheated approach to agriculture and economy and so on? But I think there's more of an emphasis on what I would see still as a kind of romance of indigeneity. And maybe it's because I come from, I grew up in South Africa, where in fact, nobody has an unalienated relationship to the countryside or the past because of the thoroughgoing ways in which colonialism drew people into a capitalist economy and into a civilizing project. It doesn't mean that there aren't indigenous cultures. They often assert themselves very strongly in relation to this other form of Euro-civilization. But I don't see them as themselves not affected by that dialogue and that conversation. So I'm much more concerned with the question of these creolized forms of knowledge that can speak back to the center, not from a radical otherness, because indeed we know indigenous societies were not frozen in some kind of timeless warp. They also had their kingdoms and their empires and their rises and their falls and their forms of inequality and their forms of democracy, right? But I think I'm much more in this work concerned with the ways in which modernity itself, the global economic and communicative system, the electronic commons, very few of us are outside of that. And we can't realistically think of solving the problems of our world, right? Without engaging them in some way. And there are already these very practical, critical, epistemological takes on the limits and the contradictions of these systems, right? From what were their margins, where people were admitted but not admitted, where they felt the contradictions, the erosive violence that was cushioned in centers was not cushioned on the periphery. So I see that in Bonaventura, but my concern much more is with seeing the various ways in which we're drawn into a general conversation and how we are placed within that to speak about things that are not just those that are, if you like, outside of the whole history of modernity, but that take that history and remake it in ways that speak to the center from a very different set of values, right? And so I don't know if that's clear, but that's what I think would be the difference.
For example, I think on page 12 of your book, you ask the following question. I want to quote you in full because that will help me to build up my question. What if we subvert the intellectual world and argue that it is the global South that affords privileged insight into the workings of the world at large? Okay, that's you and John in your own words. The question that I have for you is one is philosophical and it's also methodological. When I was rereading your book, I kept asking myself the following question. What if you were, if your personal life story and experiences emerged from East Africa, for example? Yeah. In what way would you, for example, talk about the global South? Because there is a sense in which the account that you are giving is strongly influenced by the internal dynamics of the history of South Africa. So the uncharitable interpretation is that it looks like it's an effort to generalize South Africa's history onto the international scene. So that's why I was then asking that, what if we play the following epistemological game? You leave South Africa and you grow up in, let's say, East Africa or West Africa. do you think you would come to the same conclusion? Right. If the context around the context in which you grew up, which had a formative influence in you, were different.
Yeah, it's an interesting question and it's an important one. And of course, I mean, we all of us come from somewhere. So the first point is to say the argument of this book is that there's no Archimedean position. Right? That we all enter the story somewhere.
Yes.
And that story, we cannot but be biased from where we come, and we try and roll back the ethnocentrism to the degree that we can, and try and see our participation in different scales and levels of generality, up to the level of the global, the imperial, whatever, from where we are. So, mea culpa, I start with Africa. You could have told the story from Latin America. You could have told it from China. I've just spent, a long time teaching in Singapore. That's another kind of periphery of the English imperial world, and another story emerges there. I think one works the case where one is and has it as an exemplary one. South Africa is interesting because it's in many senses a first world, third world frontier. It's one of the centers of colonial capital. It remains a huge extractive economy. And it was an experiment in colonial fascism and racism that took very general colonial principles and worked them to the extreme degree. So that segregation had an elaborate theology, it had an elaborate legal apparatus and so on. So it's a fully worked case. And that's why in some senses, the counterintuitive thing is to say, is more like Australia and the US as settler colonies than it is like the rest of Africa. But I would argue that the point, however, is to use it as a case, an instance, a token of a type, and not as one's only way into the story. For instance, if one started from East Africa, well, Kenyatta, first leader of independent Kenya, had a PhD in anthropology from a European university, and was himself incorporated, wrote, an ethnography that I use for teaching whenever I teach African studies. Right? So there is a dialectic already there, and the whole history of the way in which East Africa developed, Kenyan nationalism developed. Mau, for instance, I would have found that as one of the most interesting, because that was an epic battle that, in a sense, spelled the end of the dream of British Empire, right? And the way in which Mau was prosecuted as an indigenous uprising that was both in itself very African in its cultural forms, and yet was incredibly knowing about the way that the logic of colonialism worked. And if one reads about Mau, it's not coincidental that it would, even the term was linked to an idea of struggles going on in Southeast Asia and so on. And you have a whole theory there of the way in which counter-colonial politics, a little bit like Gandhi in another way here, you use the weakness of being a colonized rural person to strike terror into the hearts of the colonial machine and so on. So there's a whole logic there that has a politics that also suggests that there's a form, for instance, of guerrilla warfare and anti-colonial struggle. And indeed something that we see still in much of the world that develops in this place, right? And is very much a kind of creolization of what were local particularities and a much more global colonial, post-colonial scene. Now, of course, the economic situation of Kenya is different from that of South Africa, but much of the contemporary literature and much of it brought out by anthropologists who had a similar background to me. I mean, Kenda Mutongi, my colleague who teaches at MIT in history, writes about colonial education, right? And that kind of hybridization of the way in which English in East schools worked into the class, gender, and race structures in Kenya in ways that are indeed theories from the South. So, and they speak to many of the things that we're trying to talk about in this book. So I do think that, and if you look, for instance, at the ongoing, sort of work in Kenya around everything from, I mean, funnily enough that you say it, because it's really interesting. I keep looking at what's going on with Trump, and the refusal to admit the outcome of elections. And I think the place that comes to mind most clearly to think this is Kenya. because they've had that problem several times with the election, right? With newly elected presidents-elect who are denied, if you like, by sitting incumbents. So drawing the relationship between the ways in which, for instance, democratic politics and the whole question of elections and its role in liberal modernity, how this has played itself out in Africa, right? And the ways in which we often say, my God, look at that, that's an African form of, the ethnicization, the refusal to accept the other. We're seeing the same thing here in many ways. So drawing that parallel would have been very much like some of the things that we're trying to do in theory from the South, using the South African case. So what I'm saying is that it's not so much the content, it's the form of analysis that I think we're trying to put forward here. Yeah? And I would argue, for instance, that just like in many of the cases we use from South Africa, the idea, for instance, of ethnicity and the way that's played into nationalism in Kenya, and in East Africa more generally, right? The rise and fall of fascistic leaders, as you've had, for instance, in Uganda. We see those things in the North very clearly now in ways that we would have thought were, if you like, peripheral and developmentally superseded. So what one is suggesting is that those kinds of, when you begin to look that way at what is the center, what is the periphery, things broke in Kenya that we're now seeing happening here. For variously complicated reasons. But I don't think we would not be able to make that kind of argument. What we would say is there are insights that come from that part of the world that run ahead of some of the insights that we've had here. And it doesn't have to do with whether it's South Africa or Kenya. It has to do with the fact that these were former peripheries that in themselves have been drawn into late modernity in ways that in fact seem now to be running ahead of a lot of the things that have happened in the West. And that has to do with the way that modernity and capitalism and liberalism and so on have worked themselves out. But it also has to do with the fact that it's not as if there is a simple evolutionary kind of pattern to history, but it's also not as if we can go back to East Africa and find, let's find the Maasai and the way that now there are interesting things here. That you can go back, for instance, to the ethnic peoples of Kenya and see that things like diets and ecological relations and so on have something to tell us in general in the world when we're dealing with scarcity and disease and so on. And that is very much the kind of thing that Bonaventura would argue. But you also have to see that these things are part of a much more, they're part of a global order of things. Right? And that therefore, it doesn't matter that one tells the story from one place or another. It's where you enter and how you see the relationships between centers and peripheries and the way they work themselves out over time.
Good. Yeah, thank you very much. Raphael, let me give over to you so that the audience can come in, and then I'll sum up at the end. Yes.
Great, thank you. So here we have one person who has written a question that I'm going to read now, and the question was asked by Jacqueline Luke, and Jacqueline asks, in our space, scholars are arguing that decolonial scholars spend too much time on critiquing Northern knowledges and how it has positioned us instead of working with knowledge in Southern contexts. What do you think of this argument?
It would help if I knew which scholars in precisely what he's talking about, because, see, I think that the interesting thing is that most of us sitting here would be hard pressed to see ourselves as either Southern or Northern. I don't think that category, I mean, and what I'm trying to argue for is that you don't just flip, you don't just say, okay, now's the time. The North has shown that its knowledge is colonizing and ultimately counterproductive, because we are facing all the problems that we thought we found in the colony. We're facing gross inequality, we're facing failing states, we're facing informal economies, we're facing a planet that is not serving us well, right? And we're facing forms of violence and so on that we used to project onto Southern countries, right? But the answer is not simply to flip, right? And to say, okay, therefore we must see, what has been done differently in the South. And that particularly indigenous knowledge will give us the answer, because it seems to me we can learn a good deal but we all share the same problems now because we reciprocally constitute each other. And this is the other thing. We are entailed north and south in each other's problems, and we use each other to define each other. So I think, many of us here are people who are the products of multiple migration. Said used to talk about the fact that it's the traveler, it's the nomad, it's the person who has to move, is displaced from one place to another, that develops a kind of estrangement and an insight into the world, right? And realizes that things are very relative and there's no simple answer, and that many things are the same, but you can do them differently. And so many of us are people who have multiply moved, but we carry with us the fact, maybe, that we start from places that might have been in their own self-consciousness and also in their political location and their economic situation, not at the center. And when we move to centers for education or in the reading we do, one moves to the center in a university in the South if you're reading, a text that's produced elsewhere. It's important that we are critical. Mm-hmm. It's important that we're critical because often that critique is where, in fact, you see where the vestiges of what are a kind of hegemonic knowledge that's no longer suitable exists. Things like, for instance, structural adjustment, neoliberalism, the degree to which just simply allowing markets to expand will rise all boats. Some of the most significant critiques that we have in the world, dependency theory, underdevelopment theory, ideas of redistribution around basic income grants and so on. A lot of that stuff came from or people from Brazil, from South Africa, from India, who confronted, say, much more hegemonic economic thinking from the US, from the World Bank, from the Washington Consensus, views of development. And they are critical of that, justly so. But there are ways of being critical that are constructive and dialectical. And there are ways of being critical that just assert a new kind of hegemony. And I think the danger here is to think that you can flip the map. There are those old maps, they're really quite funny, that were produced in places like India and South Africa, that puts the South on the North and the North in the South. So London is in the South, and Johannesburg and Delhi are in the North. And the idea is you flip the map and you'll get a different world. And I think what we're saying here, you can't just flip the map, because we're all implicated in a multilateral world where we are conditions of each other's possibility. We're all drawn into a form of modernity, of global trade, of global communication. And it's not so easy to simply say, well, let's take the defunct modern theories and modes of development and reassert something else that is different. Because in fact, a lot of the theory that comes from southern countries or from the peripheries of Europe has already reached us in multiply mediated forms, right? And so it's come from the fact that many people writing economic theory, writing anthropology from the centers in Europe and America are themselves Southern people who've been transposed. So it's a very, it's a moving kind of dialogue. I do think that a criticism of the North is important, but I think that often it's not so straightforward because, as I say, we're already criticizing ideas that have been multiply exchanged. But I do think ultimately that there is a danger of thinking that we can replace one kind of hegemony with another. And the answer surely is to identify problems and to use our location, what Sinfree was raising. What do you learn about the limits of development, market-based development, if you're working from Kenya? And you've seen that simply introducing market-based agriculture on a large scale does not solve the problem, because many people are rendered landless, and many local forms of sustainable agriculture are much more, in the long run, ecologically sensible and inclusive. Now, that doesn't say that we're not going to use pesticides and we're not going to engage in the international market or whatever, but it does suggest that there's certain things that come from that particular place that are important to feed into the debate and the criticism. But it's a multilateral one, and ultimately surely one that is about a dialogue in relation to the big problems that we face. And if we haven't learned that with a pandemic now, I don't know when we'll learn it. I mean, one of the interesting things now is that the pandemic laid bare all of these problems, of the fact that we are ostensibly universal, but there still are peripheries, and not only in the South. I mean, look at the US and the way that the pandemic has been mismanaged, but what it shows us about resiliency and poverty and its impact on health and so on. But in solving the problem, we think we may have a vaccine now, and it's a collaboration between something in the US and something in Germany. And some of the ideas that are put to work there came out of dealing with Ebola in Africa. So it seems to me that that's the way in relation to particular problems that we need to speak to each other. We have to hear the criticisms from where we are not. But presumably we have to develop a way of debating and arguing and not thinking that you take one slide out of the machine and you put in another one as a kind of total replacement.
Good.
Thank you. We have a couple more questions here in the chat box, one from Desmond Odugu and the other one from Christina M. Douglas. I'm going to start then with Desmond's question. Southern theory in its various postures appears to have not only an academic interest, but also a political one, committed to undoing the structures of power and violence. Since Southern theories are largely products of the same intellectual forces of imperialist modernity, would you consider theory itself as part of that imperial modernizing project? Would the political commitment of Southern theories become more viable if we abandon theorization, viewed here as a totalizing project of setting up cultural hierarchies?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, it's absolutely crucial. Look, I think that, and what is theory is one of the things we try to address in that book. Who makes theory? Who are the theory-making classes? You know, is it the philosopher and his poor? Is it those who have the luxury to think because they don't have to work? Is that our vision of theory that kind of comes from the whole kind of, classical European tradition and implies a kind of elite kind of external position of people who are not engaged in the world but can bethink it and pass it on to other elites in a ways that, that don't touch the practical world. And I think one of the things we are arguing in that book is that fetishism of theory is precisely what one needs to get away from. And I don't know if in where you live and work, you have the same thing. I mean, we have with our students a real concern around what is theory. You'll write an essay and you say, but what goes into the theoretical section? And it's like you have to become somebody else and move to learn another language to kind of bespeak in these terms, from some kind of external godlike position. I think that we would all do very much better. And that's why I think terms like, ideation or ideology maybe work better. And I don't mean ideology only in the Marxian sense, that means only the ideas of the ruling class, but I mean ideas that are engaged in life, right? And that emerge from practice, because nobody can live in the world without thinking about it, contemplating, speculating. So the practical speculation about the way in which one goes about one's work. I mean, many of us who've spent time in agrarian communities will sit in the fields with people as they look at their crops and begin to talk about what's doing well and what isn't, and it's a basis for thinking in a much more kind of reflective meta dimension about things. But that doesn't count as theory, because either the people are not theory makers or because it doesn't partake of a certain kind of language and elite position in terms of the language used and the context and the media that are used to circulate it. So one of the arguments we make in theory from the South is that theoretical thinkers, for instance, in Africa, are often regarded as informants rather than theorists by much of the kind of writing, particularly in the elite disciplines. Right? And you see this kind of the key ideas. I mean, for instance, African ideas about witchcraft are theories of causality and conspiracy and critique and the ways in which people do evil to others by affecting them mentally and materially. When they were trying to explain McCarthyism in America in the 1950s, it was the work of Monica Wilson, the anthropologist who wrote about witchcraft in Africa, that came to their service. Right? So this is a philosophy of evil. And if you read about how T.S. Kuhn developed his idea of the theory of scientific revolutions, you'll see that his idea of paradigm came from his mediated reading through somebody else, one of his teachers, of Evans Pritchard writing about witchcraft in Africa. So what is theory is a key question, and for what purpose, and how do we leverage it? And in what ways can one, for instance, if you're working with agriculture in Africa, or you're working with architecture for the poor, the new developments that have come out of things like Shack Dwellers International are movements that say the poor know what they need and they know how to build. And they can inform somebody who maybe has the money and the technical wherewithal. but the vernacular architecture will be much more serviceable to them. And these are theories about the way everyday life is organized in particular times and places and what is effective and efficient. So the politics of theory is very important, it seems to me. Who calls it? Where do we find it? Where does it circulate? It was very interesting to me that, in 2009, the South African Ministry of Higher Education actually set up a kind of charter for the social sciences. And the argument was, we need to produce theory and we need to produce it ourselves. And what do we mean by it? We need to understand what the global order means and how people like us are being positioned in a world where things like the financial crisis can happen. And we don't have our own grounded theories and ways of explaining it and therefore acting upon it. And that was interesting to me because at the same time as in the West, many universities and disciplines were pulling away from theory. In many parts in Latin America and Africa, people realized that theory was politically essential. It was a way of understanding where you are in the world from where you are now and using that as a basis for deciding priorities, policy, and so on. So, I'm very much with you. I think we need to depoliticize, or if you like, not depoliticize, to defetishize theory, but also to expose how much, for instance, development theory is in fact about economic colonization, right, in many places, right? And being ready to call ideas for what they are and showing how they operate politically. We must be very critical, but at the same time, we also need to be able to assert the value of our own ideas. If they come from, and they don't come necessarily from the academy, they often come from the world of practice. Much theoretical insight in our world now comes from movies, from people in the work with art and aesthetics, and are in a position. I mean, I don't know if people here know the film Sorry to Bother You by Boots Riley. If you want to understand how race and capitalism work in America, that is a living theory that's told through the narrative of film. And that's theoretical more than anything else, in my view. Second question.
Yes, that comes from Christina M. Douglas. Can you unpack how decolonization of knowledge production in African studies is playing out differently across the sciences, including applied sciences and medicine, and the humanities, particularly considering the differential resources and facilities investments of universities and institutes in the North? I'm concerned with extractivist approaches in STEM-oriented African studies and how these are perhaps receiving greater investment as areas perceived as having great potential to address big challenges like climate change, etc.
Yeah, this is a very important question. And look, what is happening now with the politics of austerity in universities, North and South, we cannot take universities for granted. And while we live in very much more endowed ones in the North, what we're seeing is that a kind of politics of austerity, and this is going to become ever more so after the pandemic, during and after the pandemic, is defunding certain areas and funding others, right? So when you get to the question of African studies, I mean, there's a huge array of things that one needs to talk about when one talks about decolonization, right? First of all, who does African studies? For the longest time, the journals and the forms of knowledge were in the hands of white Northerners, many of them former colonial officials even, right? District commissioners who came back from Kenya with their knowledge and sat in Oxbridge and here, the forms of African studies that were produced in historically Black universities tended to be seen as too political. There was no dialogue between them and what happened in elite universities. So there has been with a large migration of African scholars and so on, there's been a real renaissance of African studies in many universities in the US. But what's happening now is that there's a shift away from the humanities and towards forms of utility. Much of it around economic policy, and a lot of it in health. Now, the investment in health is important because, in fact, there's a tremendous amount of work done from Northern universities in places like Africa, for instance, around the pandemics and Ebola and so on. But these can also be new forms of colonization. There are many places in which the agenda setting for what happens in the wake of Ebola or what happened in AIDS with AIDS are set by Northern interests and Northern institutions. And it's very difficult for African countries, for instance, to decide how they relate to these forms of knowledge production that also have their practical side and are not only about sometimes, opening up the ground for new forms of, if you like, investment in things like agriculture, but are also new kind of laboratories in which northern universities do their work, right? So for instance, Rwanda is an interesting instance where the current government there is very sensitive to who they allow to come in under the guise of the disciplines or African studies. If you're coming in to do a study which is about, for instance, the incidence of cancer or the treatment of a particular kind of disease or anything, right? You have to justify why you're doing this and in whose interest the knowledge is being produced. And you have to be designated a local partner who will work with you, not only to learn your skills, but to get a sense of the applicability of these forms of knowledge to the local needs and economy and so on. And that's a kind of a sensitivity to the ways in which research and the promulgation of knowledge, particularly in the non-humanistic side, but not only, can in fact be driving other kinds of interests. And of course, we know that area studies started in the US at the time of the Cold War. It was very much driven by the need to teach language and knowledge of countries that were of strategic interest to the US. We also know that you can make value from that. There can be a Robin Hood principle where you take what is politically questionable investments in knowledge production and turn it to use. And a lot of the kind of knowledge that we developed about the Middle East and about Africa and about Latin America and so on came from that period of area studies. But there also has always been a politics. I mean, after 9/11, for instance, the only money you could get in many aerial studies programs was to study things which were regarded religion and violence. And when some of us said, yes, religion, we'd love to look at what's happening. I mean, after all, Islam, Christianity are major civilizational forces that also have all kinds of, practical impacts on the way people think about the world, theory making and so on. We were told only if it has a strategic interest, does it relate to religion and violence? Certain religions were violent. So one's got to be very careful. And I think if I pick up something in this question, there is certainly, and I can see it in my university here, in African Studies has moved away from a strong investment in the arts and sciences, the arts and humanities, and much more towards STEM and business, which is not the worst thing. Entrepreneurialism in Africa is important, but the question is who's doing what for whom. And there's another dimension to this in African studies. There's a real sense that somehow Africa should be funding African studies in northern universities. And fundraisers from wealthy northern universities go to places where there's money like Nigeria and West Africa, now South Africa and so on, to try and raise money to support African studies. And that money often should, in my view, be going to local scholarship and local universities. So it's a politically nuanced question, but I think looking at things like development right now, where with a concern with global migration, a lot of the work on development is really going into trying to secure, for instance, in Africa, countries in the Sahel that are seen to be producing, if you like, too much destitution and migration to the north. And so development is being tied to a kind of much more strategic sense. Now, that can have useful dimensions to it, but it's also often linked to a kind of securitization that sails under the colors of African studies, development studies, and so on. And of course, the land grabs that are going on in Africa now, again, under the guise of agricultural or agrarian upgrading, have got to be looked at very carefully. And this is not only coming now from the north, Southeast Asia, the new axis between Africa, China, which is really replacing in many ways the old north-south colonial dialectic. That also is a new imperial advent, which has an incredibly complicated story to it, right? And there's a lot of development going on in Africa, and much of it taking over where northern states have dropped the ball. But the implications of all of this, in terms of what they mean for securing resources, scarce resources on the African continent, for bringing new forms of smart technology that have all sorts of surveillance capacities, all of that has to be thought about, I think, in relation to this.
Great, thanks. There's still one set of questions here, but before I move to that, I'd just like to mention that we might still have time for one or two more questions before Makoni discusses what we have been talking about here, and then we can go to the after hours party. So if you have a pressing question that you've been saving up for later, please ask them in the chat. This is the time. And yes, now I'll go to the set of questions asked by Teboho Motobole, which I assume are follow-up questions to your answer to Desmond's question. So I'm struggling here a bit to reframe the question so then I can go back to that part of the discussion. So I wonder if Teboho would like to ask the questions.
Thank you, Raphael and Jean. Part of the question have been answered, but I definitely would like to hear Jean address specifically just Chinese incursion into Africa as a new colonial power, probably based on technological exploitation, and claim that this is equal partnership.
Yes.
And it's really not direct, like hegemonic Euro-America, which was clear. It is exploitation that is straight and makes no excuses. But this is a deceptive China, which has a program to colonize and exploit, hugely in African resources. And it really doesn't necessarily fall or clearly be understood by a reference to the Southern theory, which had so much more closer dialogue with Northern hegemony.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Look, we've entered a new moment from this point of view, and it's probably been there for much longer because, in fact, the Chinese story in Africa goes back a much longer way, right? When I was doing field work in Botswana in the 1960s, there was already Chinese agrarian kind of, hydroponic kind of, they were already there, seeding the ground and bringing things that were very useful, right, in many ways, right? So it's a complicated thing, this because it operates also at many levels. At one level, there's the formal state-to-state, Belt and Road, the kind of development that the West used to provide, and development in question mark. There was the state-to-state development that built roads, and in many ways compensated for the extractivism of what colonialism did, right? When the British retreated from Botswana in 1966, they left 6 miles of tarred road, but a lot of extraction, right? And so the coming of this kind of development to build infrastructure, given that we all now function in a global context, is important. So the Chinese at one level are doing things that the rest of the world is not prepared to do. Building the Belt and Road, right? Building railroads, producing capacity to states that still suffer the fact that colonial extraversion continues, right? I mean, colonial mining companies, colonial extraction still takes huge amounts of the wealth out of Africa, right? And so, this sort of project is in many ways welcome. You have that. Then you have the kind of middle order, the so-called private corporate world of business, which says, no more imperial relationships of paternalism. This is a win-win situation. We are equal as would be business partners, right? And so there's the kind of corporate operation in everything from drugs to cell phones to the development of hotels to all kinds of business, right? Mining at that level. And the corporations from China, of course, are always state-backed corporations. So they have a kind of competitive advantage. They ostensibly are freestanding corporate companies, but they also have incredible abilities to draw on the state and its interests. And then you have this other domain, which is the kind of individual but huge numbers of Chinese entrepreneurs, small business people, who live in and operate stores all over African cities and so on. And so it's a multi, and then you have also even informal miners, right? The small mining industry, the sort of criminalized small miners that are taking over from corporate mining in many parts of West Africa, Congo, South Africa, also Chinese. So the question is, first of all, there are many players, right? And the implications of this, because it operates at all levels. You've seen the transformations in the Horn of Africa that came with a railroad, right, from Djibouti to into Ethiopia, right? And the railway and communications operate and provide all kinds of new possibilities for communication, political action, but they also open the way for new forms of investment that are often very extractive. One of the things that is most interesting to me is the degree to which smart technology is arriving on the African scene, right? So for instance, 5G, you know, the whole question of Huawei and the sense that forms of technology that are sold simply as ways of speeding up communication and providing African governments with certain forms of sovereignty that they wouldn't have without it. Like for instance, in South Africa, crime control in certain parts of the country has been one of the things that the Chinese have addressed by providing new forms of electronic CCTV and mega surveillance, right? But in that process, many argue, new forms of political surveillance are also being brought in. Smart cities in East Africa, again, to come to Rwanda. Rwanda wants to reconfigure itself as a technological frontier in Africa, and it's clearly cleverly playing off old Western aid with new Chinese aid. But the fact is that an already authoritarian regime is being given new kinds of ways of organizing data, surveillance, and so on, that has implications politically. And the very idea that, you know, the old regimes from the north had a civilizing and political ideology, and that in fact this is not the case with Chinese, it's just business, is of course, I mean, there's never that kind of technological transfer without some kind of ideological view, right? And even the sense that this is not civilizational, you know, is itself an ideological position, because China in fact is opening up Confucius institutes all over and teaching the language and so on. So it's a very complicated issue, because obviously there is a larger view here of securing resources at a time where food security, land security, we know that this is going on everywhere. But of course, it's not only the Chinese that are doing this. You know, the West is also now trying to follow up with new forms of kind of credit and technology. The Middle East is buying up land. And so there are many players, right? India is increasingly involved in parts of Africa too. But the Chinese story suggests a kind of lateralization. And what is interesting in all of this is the informal dimensions of this. There are now very large numbers of African traders, technicians, engineers, students, researchers of all kinds who are in China, who are learning Chinese, and there are Chinese that are in Africa. And there's a circulation, a kind of lateral circulation that is creating a whole pathway, a developmental and political pathway that is, in a sense, rendering less and less significant the place of the West and the North in Africa, right? And most recently, it's around things like drugs. And it's not only China here. India is a very big player too. Yeah? And India also has its own interests in relation to all of this. So your question is very significant. But I think the point is that one must also assume that Africans also have agency in this, that it's not just a Chinese-driven process, that what gets taken, what gets used, how it gets used, and the internal critique is also beginning to develop. And in South Africa, in several universities now, there's some very interesting work going on, a kind of critical neo-imperialist work around this relationship.
There's one final question that popped up here in the chat box, asked by Sangeeta Bhagagupta. You argue convincingly in theory from the South that we are all implicated in the modernity project, and flipping South-North is not a solution. What do you think about the reflexive need for scholars' positionalities to be transparent, i.e. an epistemic practice of positionalities being made available in the scholarship?
Yeah, this is an important question. And as I say, I mean, I think that many of us, I mean, most of us writing on these topics now are multiply displaced. You know, we come from one place, we were educated in another place. Sometimes there were unexpected dimensions in our education, Christian schools, whatever, you know, various kinds of forms of educational political affinity, local kind of organizations that drew one in and out. There's a long journey into the production of scholarship. And in that regard, I think it's important that we declare to the degree that we can, but I think there also is in some ways a trap in being too concerned with this form of reflexivity, because first of all, reflexivity is important, but so are the questions in the world. And there was a moment in anthropology in the 1990s and early 2000s where you began to learn more about the speakers, the scholars, than you did about what they were speaking about. And so, and linked to that, we can never fully declare. We all, Bourdieu always says, that much of what is important in a habitus or in a world is what goes without saying because it comes without saying. We bear with us all kinds of forms of politics, of knowledge, of implication that we're not even aware of. Right? And so I think we can never fully disclose, is what I'm saying, what we bear. And we're often agents of projects of which we're not aware. And that's what's so interesting about colonial knowledge. The missionaries that came to convert people to Christianity actually carried with them many things they didn't intend. Commodity fetishism was one of them, but a certain critical consciousness was another. And the fact that they were so bent on the fact that they were bringing people into the world of the kingdom of God and a form of universality was in fact belied by the way they behaved. So their own contradictions in the way they presented themselves and the way they behaved. Yes, you can come into the church, but you always remain on the bottom rung because you've got a long way to go. You're in the adolescence of civilization, all of that stuff. They weren't aware of it, the missionaries, what they were doing, but what they were bringing was a kind of contradictory system that the people who received it got insight from. And they realized there is no such thing as a universal, or they realized that many systems that claim to be universal and egalitarian actually keep perpetuating inequalities of gender, of race, or whatever. So I think it's important to declare to the degree that one can, and certainly things like where the money comes from or what a project is about or who one teaches, all of that is important. But I think we've also got to be aware that we also never fully, I mean, I don't regard myself as a colonizing scholar, but to many people, I'm sure I am. Right? So there's this question of being aware. And I think this is also around the question of the ethics of scholarship. It's not a once and for all thing. As the world changes, what one writes and what one represents changes with it. So theory from the South, I would have done differently now. I would have certainly brought in a different kind of colonizing, decolonizing language. And the question of where, for instance, China fits in all of this, which is something which we try to deal with the idea of the eccentric forms of knowledge. Maybe we have to think differently about that, and think again about this. It's not simply the North-South metaphor now, because the East-West one is becoming ever more salient. So what I'm saying is that I think ethical questions you have to constantly review who you are, whom you're writing for, what's going on in the world around one, how what one does can be recoded. So as I say to students, you don't just sign off on an IRB because of the ethics of the work you're going to do in a field context. You've got to constantly review what is ethical, how the politics of the situation, the balance of forces, what you represent, what the people you're looking at or working with represent. And so it's got to be an ever-present attitude. And I think it's a balance between reflexivity and the fact that there's certain things in the world that one really should be talking about and writing about because they're really important, right? And so it's not only about oneself, but it's about talking about issues out there. I worry that the critique takes over to the degree now that it becomes so self-obsessed, particularly in the Northern Academy. It's now mea culpa. What have we done? How can we understand? But there are things out there that we need to, and people we need to join, scholarship we need to support, and real problems as well. So it's the politics also and the pragmatics of it, not just the kind of self-cultivation in the academy, which seems to me to be important.
Okay, if Makone keeps his summing up short, we have time for one final question that's in the chat box that I'd like to ask now, and that comes from Ivana Ansik, and the question is, indigenous TEDx scholars in North America and Australia have demonstrated how indigenous systems of thought do persist to this day and continue to mediate social relations, provide critical perspectives on incursions of the state and capitalism, etc. So why not think about African systems of thought, for instance, animist ones, in a similar way? They function entirely outside the anthropocentric and Eurocentric theories about subjecthood, development, labor, etc. But that is why they also provide critical insight on how those ideas were developed within colonial, capitalist, and racializing formations. Are these indigenous critical genealogies necessarily fetishized?
Yeah, very interesting question. The answer to the last question is not at all. And I spent much of my life as a PhD student working on African systems of thought about illness and healing and so on. Now, I fully take your point, and I think it's really important, but I would say that there are no indigenous knowledge systems that are unaffected by their dialogue with the wider world and by the worlds in which they operate. And my view would be it doesn't in any sense diminish the importance of calling them and calling themselves indigenous. But I find it fascinating and it has everything to do with one's positionality, one's genealogy, where one thinks one comes from, but also the very way in which one is critical of efforts to, if you like, invade one's world or surround it and carry it away in the name of a commodity. The book we wrote, Ethnicity Inc., is about how indigenous systems have increasingly become commodified as a kind of exotic brand for tourism or consumerism, right? But I think in this one also has to keep in mind certain images. What is interesting to me about divination and the way in which the work of ancestors or malevolent others is diagnosed in the world I know in Southern Africa is that it's now done on the internet. And it's been inside the market economy for a very long time. And there are many medical systems that operate simultaneously with biomedicine and with these forms of sociocentric explanation for disease. So provided one accepts that these worlds are not, indigenous knowledge is not something separate from the world that persists without dialogue with it, I'm fully on board with you. And I think there is more than that. There's a great strategic advantage to being able to speak to systems of power and hegemonic systems from that perspective. But I would not see those systems as themselves unchanging and completely cut off from the world. I think the value is that they engage that world and they assimilate many things, including modern media, for instance, and modern commodities. You know, folk dress in many parts of the world is made with fabric that comes from the West and was exported during the Industrial Revolution. But it enabled folk indigenous costume to develop in all kinds of ways that were still distinctly their own, but they were also in conversation and they spoke back to fashion and said, you can keep changing your styles. We have a sense of what we think is beautiful and we reproduce it, but we reproduce it in ways that are also part of the modern world. And that would be my caveat, but I think I fully agree otherwise with what you're saying. It's not a fetish at all.
Okay, thank you, Jacqueline, Desmond, Christina, Teboho, Sangita, and Ivana for your very interesting questions. And thank you, Jen, for engaging with each of them so comprehensively. And sorry, Makani, for taking some of your time, but the floor is yours now. I think you have to unmute yourself.
I'm not going to try and sum up the discussion. I'm just going to try and highlight what I think are issues that came up, which we may want to think about as we go along. Listening to Jean and then to the responses to the questions, it became quite clear to me that somehow we need to think of Southern theories at a global level. What do I mean by this? What I mean is we need to move away from simply thinking of Southern theories in terms of a complex relationship between the South and the North, and etc. We need to find a way of incorporating within the constructs of Southern theories that we are building what Jean was talking about, the internal critique of Chinese imperialism within Africa or globally. So we need to find a way of including that particular dimension. But once we begin to do that, other possibilities open up. We then need to find a way of thinking about Southern theories and exploring what sort of relationships may exist between Southern theories and the theories which are being produced in the former post-Soviet republics by scholars who are working in those areas, because that is another dimension that we may need to think about. What is it that the post-Soviet Republic scholars are working on, and what are their views about issues relating to Southern scholarship. And once we do that as part of a global project, then we can be able to think about the relevance, for example, of Caribbean thinking and Caribbean philosophy on Southern theories. In other words, what I'm arguing for in the, as I close this session, the formal part, is a Southern theory that is much more global in its aspiration. Right. That I think is all that I want to talk about. Yeah.
Great. Jen, would you like to share your final thoughts before we move on to the after party?
Sure. I think that's extremely interesting. And Sinfree, the reason that I shorthanded the term creolization in a lot of what I was saying was that, in fact, none of this would happen. And people, for instance, like Fanon,
Yes.
but so people like Michel Rolf Trio
Yes.
are all people who have contributed precisely because, and
Yes.
there again, the position, for instance, of Haiti,
Yes.
which in many ways, you know, is sort of Africa in the West, right? And if you think about the ways in which in America, the complicated attitudes towards Haiti have been configured, but the fact that this was in fact one of the earliest revolutions we had at a global scale, right? And they were post-colonial before many other places were even colonial. So, so that is crucial. And what you said about the former USSR, you know, we have a couple of students here who are working on these issues. And one of them wrote spoke about an article in a Moscow paper which said that Russia is Africa with snow, or it's like Nigeria with rockets. Right? So there's a recognition of their structural similarity in a way, which raises this question again, and I want to just emphasize this to end. A lot of this is about Europe and its outsides, right? Euro-America and its outsides. And the question of the first, second, and third world, as they once were, in relation to this is extremely important because there's a whole, for instance, in Russia, there's a whole new form of thinking, a materialist way of thinking about the contemporary world and the future, which does things very differently from the way that we do it, at least in Europe, right? It's looking at the same history, but from a long history of a kind of materialism rather than a liberal Christian kind of theoretical frame, right? And it does things in a way that it's a dialogue, it's a species of world theory making, right? It's very much universalizing that we should be much more in conversation with.
Yes.
There are people within the US who are trying to do that work in US universities and translate it, but this is the sort of thing that in this kind of forum, i.e. thinking about what Southern theory would be and the work that it can do, particularly in relation to the new imperia. And I would end by saying new forms of post-liberal politics. Right? If you think about what's going on in this country right now, and the other places in the world where we see parallels, we realize that our own theory of liberalism and democracy and politics needs to be profoundly rethought. And the suggestions you're making, I think, are very useful ones in that task. So thank you very much. And the questions were fascinating. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Right. Raphael, it's up to you.
Or Magda?
Yes. So once again, thank you so much, Jean, for this wonderful session. There are already some messages of gratitude. So some people are already saying goodbye. So we reached the end of our formal presentation. I will stop the recording right now.